Good evening. Thank you so much for attending the Indigenous History of Bloomington, Minnesota. And I would like to thank you to our presenters, Dr. Kate Beane and Peter DeCarlo, with us tonight. I would like to take a moment to respectfully recognize and acknowledge that we are on traditional land of the Dakota people. My name is Alejandra Palenka, and I am the Director of Creative Placemaking here at the City of Bloomington. Creative placemaking is really a process, and it's about art playing an intentional role in community development to help establish a more walkable, vibrant, welcoming, and distinctive destination. Outcomes for this process can include things like public art, presentations like tonight, performances, workshops. Right now we have a community garden with artful components in development, and an upcoming small business center. Honoring the existing character, assets, and history of a place is vital to creative placemaking work. So a few years ago, the city's Creative Placemaking Commission commissioned a South Loop history report to inspire our work. So we did print a few copies. I think we might have already run out, but I'll take a look if we have any more. We also have it available as an electronic report. And after the presentation tonight, we will email everybody a link with both the link to view the presentation and to the document. Up until this year, our creative placemaking efforts were focused in the South Loop district. But now we're working towards expanding our work citywide, which is very exciting. So to learn more and to stay updated on our projects and events such as this one, and to receive the links that we talked about before, I have a creative placemaking email list over there, and that will subscribe you to news and updates. Just wanted to do a few housekeeping notes. Restrooms and the water fountain are located just directly across the hall. Complimentary tea is available from Blue Hummingbird Woman, so please help yourself. Please take a moment to make sure that your phones are silenced or turned off, and refrain from taking photos and videos of this presentation. The presentation will be recorded, and it will be played on cable TV, and as I mentioned before, we will have a link to view later to everyone here tonight, also those on the wait list, and shared on our website. And with that, I will pass it on to Peter DeCarlo. Please enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming here this evening for this convening, this discussion of Indigenous history of Bloomington, and thanks for braving the heat and making it. My name's Peter DeCarlo. I'm a historian at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I also do a lot of independent research and writing, and that's how I came to work with the Placemaking Commission, as was mentioned. And my fellow presenter is Dr. Kate Beane, historian as well, placemaker, name reclaimer, director of an art museum. She'll tell you more later. She's amazing. She'll join us for the second half. So we'll be going through two parts. First, about 35, hopefully 35 minutes of a history presentation based on the report, which I'll give, and then we'll move into a discussion with Dr. Beane about how this history relates to today, contemporary issues of land acknowledgements, which we've probably heard throughout this festival and today appropriately, and also the land back movement, the movement for Indigenous peoples to reclaim some of the land that was taken from them. And so tonight I'll be moving quickly to the time period where the United States and Dakota people came into contact with one another, because that's really the period where this land, the dispossession of Native people, where the colonization of the land, the treaties, and in particular the changing of that land into private property, the system with which Native people are working to reclaim their land, that's where it comes from. So I'm going to kind of cover the first 1,000 years quickly, establish this as Dakota homeland, and then move into the 1850s, which is really a whirlwind of change right here in the area that became known as Bloomington. Okay, so first of all, the mound builders in the Oceti-Sakowin. So the first recorded instance of human habitation here, according to archaeologists, it dates to 12,000 years ago, essentially when the last ice age ended. That evidence takes the form of nint flappings, nappings of flint, and different archaeological sites in the area. And in Bloomington, the bounds of it itself, that conservatively dates to 8,000 years ago and most likely 12,000. So the main point being that as soon as the glaciers receded, people were living here, and these indigenous peoples are the ancestors of the Dakota and other indigenous peoples today. Around 200 BCE is when the tradition of mound building starts to be in evidence in the archaeological record, and archaeologists theorize that this tradition came up from Cahokia, the large site down in present-day Illinois, up the Mississippi, and then came here to Minnesota. And there is a documented 10,000 plus mounds in existence today in Minnesota, and undoubtedly that many or more were destroyed by colonization. And these mounds in this area and other areas took the forms of burial mounds, sacred burial mounds, and also sacred effigy mounds that would be in the shape of different spirits or animals. So these mound builders were also the ancestors of the Dakota people. Now, the Oceti-Sakowin is the 7 council fires. You may know them as the Dakota people, the Lakota, sometimes the Nakota are also used in that, and others may know them as the Sioux people today, another term that is used and also used in many of the titles of their present-day communities. So the Dakota people who lived in this region were part of the 7 council fires, and particularly here, of the 4 that were Dakota, the one that lived right in this region were the Bede-Wakantuan, and other council fires went up and down the river to visit sacred sites in this region. And as many may also know, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers is known as Bedote, and it is a site of creation for many Dakota people. One of their stories places their beginnings there at that sacred site. And in the last few decades, I feel more and more Dakota people, elders, scholars are coming forward to identify other sacred sites in the Twin Cities, and we now know, and it's been shared with all of us others, that these sacred sites exist throughout the Twin Cities. So some have come to refer to this region around the confluence as more of a sacred district, a sacred area, the Bedote sacred area, and so here in Bloomington, that is very much a part of this history as well. And so chronologically in time, by 1700 in the written record, and at least by 1750, we can think of this confluence area as very much in the center of Dakota homeland, which stretched all the way to the present-day Dakotas across Minnesota. It's concentrated on the Minnesota River, north and south, and also west of here to the Mississippi River and down that river to Iowa. So there were village sites located along the river, and right here on Minnesota Waukpa, the Minnesota River, is where many of those village sites were, and many of the Dakota people still view those sites as very important and sacred today. The fur trade, moving into the first era of contact between European Americans and the Dakota people. So the first Europeans in this region were French. They came out of what's present-day Canada. That was called New France, was the French colony in North America. And the first documented contact between the French and the Dakota occurred around 1660. And the first documented instance of any European American coming into this area of Bloomington was in 1695, and those were French fur traders. Now, the fur trade was all based on an extractive form of colonialism. So Europeans, specifically the French, then the British, then the Americans, were interested in extracting furs from this land so that they could be turned into mostly fur felt hats in Europe. And in this period, which lasted about 200 years, from 1660 to 1860, this is a period where Native people really held all of the power. The fur trade narrative historically in history and in written documents and in histories has always kind of been told over the shoulder of the fur trader, following the explorer, the fur trader, into these wild lands, and they're pioneers and they establish their posts. But in reality, if we flip this narrative, we get a much more accurate history. So Dakota people, Ojibwe people, they welcomed these traders into their land. They told them where to build the fur posts. If they didn't want them there, they could drive them out. So it's really a period where the social structures, the political structures, the economic structures of Native societies are what governed this fur trade. And another important part of it, at the center of this image, this is an image of marriage between a Native American woman and a European American fur trader. So women, Native women, were at the center of this period of the history, not only as builders of families and intermediaries between the cultures. They were political leaders at the time, economic leaders, and even leaders in the trade. So the main takeaway of this period of time is that before colonization really began and Dakota people faced the United States in this area, there was 200 years of interaction, of families building, of cultures melding. And Native women were central to that. Okay, so this slide is really setting the stage. What was it like here in 1800? Who was here? Historians, sometimes we conveniently want to put things into periods. That's what I'm doing here for ease. So around the year 1800, who was living here before the United States really began to enter the region? So as I mentioned, this was very much at the center of Dakota homeland. And there were several villages in this area where Bloomington is and surrounding it. So first, I think today it's just across the river where Highway 77 crosses was Ohanska, the village of the Long Avenue, also known as Black Dog's Village. A lot of these villages took on the name of their hereditary leaders, names that were passed down, and so European traders would just name the village after that leader, so that's where a lot of these other names come from. An offshoot of Black Dog's Village on this side of the river in Bloomington was a band led by Kaboka, also known as the Drifter, and as the name kind of signifies, him and his people moved around quite a bit, but they were residents of the area that became Bloomington. At the mouth of 9 Mile Creek, where the creek enters the Minnesota River, was Titanka Tanina, or the Old Village, and some believe that's a reference to it being perhaps the oldest Dakota village along the Minnesota River. And this was also known as Penishon's Village, Penishon being a French name given to the hereditary leaders of that village. Let's see, back to Titanka Tanina, the Old Village. So that was led by different leaders throughout time that we'll talk about a little bit more specifically. But Wanyaka Inajin, he sees standing up, and also Kenku Washte or Good Road were leaders of that village, and they would be the leaders at the time that treaties were signed with the United States. And of course, I have to mention in 1843, Maipia Wichasha, Cloudman, moved to this area too, and Kate can tell you a lot more about him and his people later. And finally, other villages were Kaposia, down past St. Paul where the river bends. There's a park named after Kaposia there. And for our interest tonight, also where present-day Shakopee is and where the Shakopee community is, that was another village named Tinta Otunwe, or Village of the Prairie. And just outside the walls here, Old Shakopee Road, that was originally a Dakota trail or road between that village and the villages here where Bloomington would be and the sacred sites of Bedote. So that's where that road began, and that's what it's named after. So in 1805 is when the first treaty or agreement is signed between the Dakota people of this region and the United States. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike came up the Mississippi River, and he landed on Weetatonka, or what's now today known as Pike Island. And he set up there an arbor for negotiations, and he asked the Dakota leaders of the region to join him there. So Wanyaki Inajin, here from Bloomington, we can picture he and his people put their canoes in the river. They went down the Minnesota River, came around the bend, and they would have seen Pike and his soldiers there with an arbor, set up the sails from their ships, and dozens, if not hundreds, of Dakota leaders and warriors and people there for these negotiations. So what Pike wanted was land to be ceded to the United States, basically in a triangle from where today Bedote exists, where historic Fort Snelling is, kind of in a large triangle up to where present-day Minneapolis is. And of 7 Dakota leaders who were there, 2 of them agreed to sign this document, and one of them was the leader from this area that would become Bloomington. Now, there are some complications, of course, with this treaty, the Pike Treaty. Some call it the agreement that Pike didn't have the authority to do this. The president hadn't commissioned him, and it's clear the majority of the Dakota didn't necessarily want to agree to it, but all of them really understood that even in the idea of ceding land, that Dakota people would always have the right to use that land, to walk across it, to live there. And it's pretty clear from the historical evidence that they believed in the tradition of the fur trade. They were just allowing the next colonial power. First it had been the French, then the British. Now they were allowing the United States to set up a post in their land, which economically in the past had always been advantageous. So that's likely what they believed was happening. So this slide is a view from Fort Snelling looking back towards the land. So this road in the foreground there with the figure walking is leading away from the fortification. And then the road that goes off to, yes, your left, it is likely the old Shakopee Road leading here to Bloomington. So this kind of represents and gives the foreground for an era of what I call competing sovereignties, where in the 1830s and 40s, the Dakota people are still very secure in their power, but the United States, moving from just wanting to construct Fort Snelling in the 1820s, they want to begin to press their authority outwards and extend their authority to police in some attempts Dakota people and to claim more land. So in the 1830s, the U.S. government wants to bring Dakota leaders from the area, including Bloomington, back together to say, okay, 1805, this agreement that was signed, did you cede us land? We believe you ceded us land. We want you to agree to it. And amongst the Dakota, there's disagreement, even amongst themselves, about what had been done, had land been ceded. And it's clear that some believed it had and some believed it hadn't, but all agreed amongst themselves that they could use this land still. So very impatient. The United States government just kind of made a power move, and in 1839 they had the military survey a military reservation around Fort Snelling, and that survey was the bounds of the Pike Treaty. And so they surveyed this, and then in 1839 they began to enforce control of that land and try to control who could be on that land. And so they did burn out some settlers that were on the land along the Mississippi. And Kaboka and his people who had lived in the area around Bloomington, they were living on that land that the Army surveyed, and they drove them out of the military reservation. And the borders of that land cut through present-day Bloomington. So for several decades, the U.S. military tried to enforce a rule of nobody living on that land at all. Another anecdote that kind of illustrates this period too is one that involves Kenku Washday, or Good Road, who would be another leader of Dakota people from the area of Bloomington. So the primary sources about him are very interesting. Missionaries like the Pond brothers, who were part of Bloomington history, and officers at the fort wrote about him always insulting them, telling them to basically get lost and leave his people alone. And he was known for insulting officers at the fort and traders. So at some point, some of his warriors and he himself insulted an army captain. So the commander at the fort sent a detachment of soldiers to Kenku Washday's village, and they arrested him. So this is outside any legal bounds of the United States, even if we side with the United States and say the military reservation was their land. And there's actually a very comical but illustrative, very enlightening description of this. So an officer wrote, "Good Road, who was then probably between 50 and 60 years of age, walking in advance of his captors a little faster than his ordinary pace, but apparently with no great exertion, while his guard, both officers and men, were all panting like overdriven oxen. The offense for which he was arrested was not a very aggravated one. He was discharged from custody soon after reaching the fort." So we can imagine in this painting here, Good Road and that detachment coming up the road from the land that would be Bloomington. And the fact that he was kind of making light of this, he's not taking it very seriously, he's making his captors look bad. He's 50, 60 years old and they can't keep up with him, and then he's released anyway. That to me really illustrates this idea of the U.S. trying to exert its power and beginning interest of policing Native people and trying to take land, but not really being able to do so yet in the 1830s and the 1840s. So I had to include some of these sketches for Kate, one of our favorite sources. You can Google it, Frank Blackwell Mayer's sketches, and they're all digitized. It's like one of the best primary source visual records of Dakota people traders in this period. So that's just a little, as a historian, I got to give you one primary source you can just go out and look at for fun. You just click through them all. So, so these two images, the man pictured there is Martin McLeod, and he was a fur trader who wouldn't have been able to be in this area without the goodwill of the Dakota people. Long story short, in 1836, he arrived in this area pretty desperate and destitute from the north near Pembina, and Dakota people helped him when he reached the Minnesota River and brought him to Fort Snelling. And part of that group of Dakota people, one of them was Mary Elizabeth Ortley, a Dakota woman who had previously married another fur trader, and they eventually were married themselves, and they came to live here in the land of that became Bloomington. And the sketch of the Dakota woman there is not Mary, but it's very representative of a Dakota woman in this time period in the 1840s and 1850s. So they're up there because their story really helps illustrate this time period of territories and treaties. As I did my research, I think in the history of the state, the history of Dakota-U.S. relations, we often talk about the treaties of 1851, which are very important. Treaties are important, and we'll talk about that. And then we often talk about the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. But even having studied this topic for several years as I did this work, I really came to view the 1850s, especially here where Bloomington came to be, was really a period of breathtaking change and transformation of the land, and it laid the groundwork for Bloomington to exist. So a few of the things that happened. So in 1849, Minnesota Territory is declared, but in reality, U.S. authority over that territory is pretty much non-existent. It's still indigenous land controlled by indigenous people. And the territory is created, and as part of that, in 1850, there is a census. And the purpose of the census is to record as many white eligible voters as possible to reaffirm the existence of the territory, because to become a territory, you need a certain population. To become a state, you need a higher population. So, and it's really interesting because in 1850, a census taker came right through this land that we're on today, but this land wasn't part of the United States. This was Dakota homeland, but these census takers were looking for every white person possible. And because of that, Martin McLeod, for instance, he's on the census, and his Dakota wife, his Dakota children, they're not on there. So it shows you in 1850, as the fur trade begins to ebb for economic reasons, it's also political and racial reasons. As U.S. colonization moves this way, it brings with it categorization of people and racial hierarchies that begin to exclude in an attempt to erase Native people from this area. So in 1851, two treaties are signed, the major land cession treaties in Dakota history, and Martin McLeod was instrumental in that. So even though he has a Dakota wife and Dakota children, he realizes the trade is ending, just like others do, such as the infamous Henry Sibley, and they devise a strategy to have a land cession treaty orchestrated so then payments can be made for that land to the Dakota, and then U.S. traders can have that money from Dakota people paid to them so they can get out of the trade and get rid of what they believe is money that Dakota people owe them from this credit system that's been going on for several decades. So Martin devises the strategy of first sending the treaty commission west of here to the upper bands of the Dakota and signing a treaty with them first, so that when they come south here to this area and negotiate a second treaty with what were called the lower bands of the Dakota, they can then say, you'll be surrounded on all sides by white settlers because your kin to the west have signed, there will be white settlers there, you have white settlers to the east, so you have to sign. And that's exactly what the treaty commissioners do on Martin McLeod's advice. So in 1851, normally the histories just kind of jump to 1851, and then the next thing we know in the histories, Dakota people are on the Minnesota reservation, but there was 2 years in between roughly that treaty signing and Dakota people actually being forced to leave this land that we're calling Bloomington today. Now, as soon as that treaty signed, The Dakota people, some of the leaders, begin fighting against it. There's resistance. They need to agree to it in a finalized way, and Congress needs to ratify it. So there's a whole process before this land can become legally in U.S. law, U.S. government land. But before any of that can happen, white settlers come to this land we're on. So we need to picture Dakota people still living here, like they have since time immemorial, and their ancestors have, and they've signed this treaty, but without warning, American citizens come onto this land and begin squatting, and they start cutting down timber. They start notching their names on trees, trying to stake claims to this land. People like Alexander Ramsey and Henry Sibley, people with authority, the soldiers at the fort who are supposed to stop this illegal behavior, they do not do so. And in fact, Ramsey and Sibley and others would look for political maneuvers to cover the movements of these squatters and eventually legalize what they had done through what's called preemption. Essentially, a squatter moves in, they claim the land, but if a preemption law is passed, they can then get title to that land when it goes for sale. So in 1853, in June, according to the written historical record, is when the last Dakota people leave this area that we're in today. Now, people like Mary, who had connections to fur traders or perhaps missionaries, some of them were able to stay, but it's really in 1853 that we can picture this land for the first time since the beginning that indigenous people were here, that they've been moved off this land through these treaties. So this is really the slide that if you take something away tonight, this would be it. The image that you're looking at there is the original land survey of the South Loop district. So that's where Highway 77, 94, and the river. And I always just tell for shorthand, people who don't know Bloomington, I say it's where Mall of America is. That's how I describe it. So that's part of the original land survey. So how did this land become part of a modern property regime, as scholars call it? So if you know terms like section, lot, acre, township, city, things like that, that all comes from this original land survey. And because we all live here, this is how whoever you are, wherever you come from, whoever your ancestors are, you live as part of this history here. So it's hard to really exaggerate even scholars call it a land craze, that, Americans were obsessed with obtaining land because it was the main mode to wealth, how to raise a family. It wasn't necessarily having a business, it was land. So people came here, as I mentioned, and began squatting on the land very quickly. And what happened was, to turn this into property, the public land survey had to occur for it to be sold to U.S. citizens. So what the founding fathers called the Immaculate Grid, Thomas Jefferson, this was really his brainchild. Literally nothing like this had been seen before in the history of humanity. There had been lots and things like that in medieval Europe, but the idea that you would remove a people from the land through treaty or through war, then you would survey every inch of that land in mile squares, then you would divide it into acres, then you would sell it to the citizens of that country to turn it into private property. Nothing had been devised like that before, and it's really just kind of breathtaking when you think about it. So the idea that really from the Mississippi in this area west, all of the United States is on a grid, and you can see that, and if you're a landowner, you probably certainly have encountered that too. So this survey occurred just 6 months after the treaty was verified, which was extremely quick in the history of the United States. Normally it took years, but here, I think as evidence of the craze for this land by settlers, it occurred very quickly because people were petitioning Congress and their territorial leaders to get this land surveyed. So in August through September of 1853, the lands we're on now, you can picture a four-man team of a surveyor, 2 carrying a long chain that they used to measure, and 1 carrying an axe clearing brush, and they literally walked 1-mile sections that became Bloomington. And as they went, the lead surveyor would write down his observations of the flora, the fauna, the land. He'd rate the soil. He would say, farms could be built here, this is terrible land. And here in Bloomington, it's very interesting. You read the surrounding notes, It's all about the flora and the fauna, but here in Bloomington it includes that, and it also mentions there's a lot of people here already. There's a lot of claimants to the land. So that occurs in 1853, and it really redraws the geographies of land and power, and it makes it so the U.S. government can then sell it as private property, and then private landowners can now exclude people from that land, own it, possess it, cultivate it. So it's really here in the 1850s that dramatic shift of how this land was conceived of in that way. And just one quote from this period from a newspaper, the Minnesota Pioneer. It says, quote, "When we see the land to which the Indian title can scarcely be called extinct being put under survey, and the only great impediment to the onward prosperity of our young and flourishing territory being removed, we have certainly great reason to be thankful." So that shows you the mood of the settlers at the time and the politicians as well. Now the final portion of this 1850 section is something strikingly modern. In 1857, there was a financial panic due to a land sale and real estate boom and bust here in Minnesota. So the bubble burst essentially, that land prices went up so quickly. People like Martin McLeod and Mary, they bought land as investments here, and then it crashed. So they ended up losing all the land they had invested in, and they could only hold on to a little bit in Bloomington. So one last thing is that in 1857, there's another census for statehood. And this is all about, again, white population and increasing it as much as possible. And it's interesting because of political maneuvering, the Democrats were in power, and they were sometimes called the Moccasin Democrats in Minnesota because they believed in more inclusion of people of mixed descent. And so in this census, Mary and her children were actually counted in the population count towards statehood. So on May 11th, 1858, Minnesota becomes a state, and it's the same date that Bloomington becomes a city as well. So this image you're looking at is a mound survey of burial mounds in the Bloomington area. For backgrounds, for this section, I just want to kind of relate a couple different anecdotes that show more of the effect of settlement and colonization and the attempted erasure of Native people from the land. So in 1862, as many of us know, the U.S.-Dakota War occurred to the west of here, and I'm not going to go into the details of that war, but it ends up that Bloomington has an intimate connection to that history. After the war, over 1,600 Dakota non-combatants, and according to research I've done, about 70% of them were Bade-Wakantuan. Kanku Washte and his band, Native people who lived here in what became Bloomington, they were part of this group of the non-combatants, and over 90% of them likely were women and children. So when we think of these people being forced marched from the west to the concentration camp at Fort Snelling, we really need to picture women and elders caring for children. And one primary source indicates of these over 1,600 people, only 40 were full-grown men of fighting age. So overall, the preponderance is women and children and the elderly. So that's what we need to picture here. And those people were marched towards the fort, and it ends up that they marched through present, what would become Bloomington, right along, I believe, Old Shakopee Road. Up that trail is what all the evidence indicates. So they came into Bloomington, they camped at 9 Mile Creek, and they would have marched right past here. So that's a connection that the city has to that history before these people were then exiled from the state. So what was Bloomington like at this time as it became a community and a city? It really epitomizes the settler farming town. So there were some historians in the 1870s in the universities in Minneapolis, and they did a history of Hennepin County, and they described every community. And they described Bloomington as a number of farmhouses, humble cottages, imposing mansions, and then, quote, as far as the eye could reach, with one continuous stretch of cultivated fields. So it's a farming community, but tellingly, this last sentence is very important. It was 14 years since the writer of this history had passed through this particular district, and the transformation from a wild tenantless prairie, which he then thought a sterile waste, to a busy and prosperous farming community was really marvelous. So there we have the settler need to say this land was uninhabited. Nobody was here. In fact, it was a wasteland before we came here. So there you have the beginnings, one of the earliest histories of Hennepin County, of this city, and its attempt at erasing Native people from that history. So two last things to note. I've been talking about Old Shakopee Road, and we could call that an indigenized place name. So we talked about the Dakota name for that village, Tinta Otunwe, and the leaders of that village hereditary were named Sakpe or Sakpedan, and Americans came to call them phonetically Shakopee. So this, the community, the place became known as the city of Shakopee, so a place name named after a person. So you can see that an indigenous name has been changed. The intention of it isn't really correct. Phonetically, it's not quite correct. But this is a way that settlers also claimed the land and indigenized it for themselves, that they could have some reference to Native people, but really also disabuse others that they had ever existed in this homeland. So final anecdote is about this picture up here. So in 1882, Theodore Lewis, an archaeologist, and others were part of this movement in anthropology and archaeology, and they all believed that Native people were disappearing. So something came about called salvage archaeology, this idea that white archaeologists needed to go out and document mounds, document any Native burial places, and a lot of times dig into these places to save these artifacts. And so in the 1880s, he was here in Bloomington, and you can picture him surveying these mounds. He's jumping fences, he's climbing through thickets, he's asking landowners now, can I see if there's any mounds on your property? Many of them have been plowed over. And to me, in a final, almost brutal, irony, many of these mounds, the way they were named and the way archaeologists interact with this information today, they were named after the landowners. So in Bloomington and across the country too, we have the names of settlers attached to these sacred burial places and sacred effigy mounds. So that's another form of erasure of Native people from the land. And now we're going to shift to a discussion with my colleague, Dr. Kate Beane, ending here on, I know, a bit of a somber note, but we know the name of this festival, Wakpa Festival, and we have many Indigenous leaders in our city moving to reclaim this history and bring it forward, and that's part of the work that we're doing today. So I'm going to hand it over to Kate so she can introduce herself.
Hamita kepi, kepi ne makiapi a heripuinde me ishkian wachian kapi. Hello, my relatives. My name is Dr. Kate Beane. In Dakota, I'm known as a Hedipiwin, brings them home woman. I'm a citizen of the Wakpai Pakshawyate, the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe out of South Dakota, but my family's originally from here. And when Peter and I were talking about this convening, we were thinking of what are some questions to ask me to kind of add some context and add to the conversations of the historical research that he's done. And I've known Peter for a while. We work together at the Historical Society, and him and his wife are two of my dearest friends. And I really respect his work. And I think that it's hard to find people that you can trust with our stories. So much of it has been documented poorly or interpreted poorly. And one of the things we talked about is sort of, what is my connection to this place? And, my family, we come from the village of Makpiawichasha and Champadutowing. And so, Heato Otue at Bede Makaska. And I say my grandmother's name, Champadutowing, because, yes, my grandfather, Makpiawichasha, was known as one of the leaders there, but you do not have leaders without the women in our lives. And the only documentation I've often seen of my grandmother, Champadutowing, Chokecherry woman, was that she was a badass and she was a hard woman, which I have a lot of respect for. And so I know that she was not, somebody that was so quiet within the community. And I know a lot of the decisions that were made under her careful watch, and yet she's not documented. And oftentimes we don't see our women in the archive. And that's part of sort of what brought me into trying to understand my family history. And so our family, my family comes from Heato Tue, which is the community at Beane and our grandfather, Makpiawi Chasha, previous to that, had lived at Black Dog's Village, and what is today known as Egan. And we're also descendants of Kaposia, and some of the other village sites along the river. A lot of those village sites were along the river. Heato Tue was to the side of the river, which is why it's called Village to the Side, because that was one of the village sites that wasn't directly along the riverway. But there's some images here that show a little bit of my family story. And so when my family first moved back to Minnesota, our family were among those that were removed. When Peter talked about the 1,700 women and children and elders, my family were with those that were forced marched. My grandfather, Cloudman, actually died at the prison camp at Fort Snelling. We still don't know what happened to his remains. We do know that a number of our relatives went up into Canada with leaders such as Shakpeda and Medicine Bottle. Two leaders that were later hanged outside of Fort Snelling on November 11th, 1865. Because of those two men, I'm here today, because they helped to protect my family. And there was a lot of us. There were thousands of us that went up into Canada trying to protect not only people, but a way of life and a society and a whole future of people. And I think oftentimes what doesn't really get understood is the fact that we were fighting to be ourselves and to be home. And those seem like really simple things, but they were two things that we continue to have to fight for today. And that is a problem. When our family came back to Minnesota. My father was born and raised on his reservation in Flandreau, South Dakota. My mom's Muskogee Creek from Oklahoma, born and raised in Muskogee. And so, my dad brought us back to Minnesota. We came back to Minnesota to reconnect with our ancestral roots here, because we knew through the writings of our grandfather, Charles Eastman, who was a really prolific writer, medical doctor, American Indian advocate, lobbyist, one of the founders of the reservation chapters of the Boy Scouts of America and the YMCA. He was one of the first writers to come out of Minnesota. He was born in 1858 here in Morton, or near Redwood Falls, but yet oftentimes he's not listed as being a writer out of Minnesota, even though he was born here in 1858 and his 11 books have been published all around the world. And why is that? And you think about why that is, and it's because of that physical erasure. But he wrote about our family here. He wrote about Cloudman's village, the village at Beane. He wrote about our family's connections. He wrote about a number of things related to our family and our story, and who we are as Native people, because he was trying to humanize us. At that time, when he was alive, people literally saw us as animals. They didn't see us as human. And he had to humanize us just at that level. And I think all these years later, in a lot of ways, we're still trying to do the same thing. And oftentimes, in the work that I do, a lot of the things that I have come to realize is that part of my job, my name, Brings Them Home Woman, was given to me by a Dakota elder who taught me that my job was to bring the stories and bring the people home. And I realized that I had to do that through storytelling, and I had to do that through humanizing that history to people. And that's why I include these images of my children, because that's the face of history. My children are, I like to call them the trifecta of the Oceti Chacoing, because they're Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. So their dad's from Pine Ridge, and my grandpa was Nakota, and so they have that ancestral connection to the Seven Council Fires. But my children have really guided me to do this work. You know, when my family and I were working on the name restoration at Bede Makaska, we really questioned sometimes. It was hard work. It took a number of years to do. And my sister and I had young children. I was pregnant at one point. It was a lot of unpaid labor to do something that we felt was really important. But it was hard. And it was thankless. And there was a lot of backlash. And we got hate mail and a lot of negativity at us. And I think at one point, I questioned, you know, and I definitely over the years have questioned, why do I focus on history? You know, and now I'm the leader of an executive director of the Minnesota Museum of American Art, and I've gone in a different route towards the art world, partly because it got so ugly simply to advocate for my people in our homeland. And it got to the point where I was afraid for the safety of my children. I was attacked at the legislature. I got hate mail. My whole family did. And part of that is because people are afraid of change. And it's rooted in fear. It's rooted in fear of understanding other people's perspectives. And it's rooted in this fear of realizing that the way history has been taught to you is not complete. And when you start to think of the nuances and the multiple perspectives, I think it's really important to understand that there's a lot of different perspectives coming from Dakota people. There's a lot of different perspectives coming from all tribes. And if you look at the history of Native people here in Minnesota, I was at the Minnesota Historical Society for almost 7 years, where I worked directly with engaging with tribal leaders, tribal governments, tribal historic preservation officers. If we had to notify a tribe about a particular space in the Twin Cities, we had to notify 23 tribes. 23 tribes that had an interest and a connection to this area. And oftentimes, people who don't understand our history will try and pit those 23 tribes against one another, because they don't understand the fact that we understand our tribal territories. We understand that Fort Snelling was not put there to bring peace between the Dakota and Ojibwe. Fort Snelling was put there for white settlement. And there's a story that gets, there's these stories and these histories that get passed down, where all of a sudden, I think a lot of people don't understand the context and the relationship between this longer history and today. And when you think about that relationship, you have to ask the people who experienced that story. My family who was forced marched out, my family that was imprisoned, my grandmother's grandfather was in prison at 12 years old. And he wrote a letter to his grandfather, Seth Eastman, who made some of these portraits here. He was a landscape artist. He was a graduate of West Point. If you know of the seal, the seal of the state of Minnesota, the state flag, Seth Eastman was the one who created that image. And his work is in the state capitol. It's pretty prolific work. Well, his grandchild was Dakota. When Peter talked about some of these military officers having having Dakota wives, I'm a product of that. My grandfather, Seth Eastman, married my grandmother, and then he left her and brought back a white wife. And when the Dakota War happened, his grandchildren, who were my grandmother's grandparents, wrote him and said, "We're children. We're stuck in prison. We're hungry. We're cold. We don't have sufficient clothing. Can you help us, grandfather?" And he never answered him. And our family has to live with that. And the fact that there's this person who has created these beautiful images that document our family story is really important. One of these images here, the women protecting the crops, shooing away the blackbirds, And then the other side is of a Dakota village site. And as you can see, we have the bark lodges, which our communities in Prairie Island and Lower Sioux are actually reconstructing now, today. And we have those lodges back in our communities now. But Seth Eastman actually did another image, which I purposefully did not put on this slide, because he created an image that showed the scaffolds that we have during our, when our family members pass away. And there are a lot of members in our community who don't like those scaffolds shown. They're private, they're personal, they have to do with our own rituals. And yet he put it out there for the whole world, right? And so, you know, I purposely don't show that image because it hurts some community members who say that's too personal to be putting out there. And I think it's important to pay attention to that. What are the things that Dakota community members and family members, you know, what are some of the things in terms of our arts, in terms of our stories, in terms of our connections to this place? What are some of the things that make us uncomfortable? Land acknowledgements make me feel uncomfortable, to be honest. You know, I understand the reason for them. I think that there's value in terms of looking inward, acknowledging, knowing the land where you're at, but there has to be something actionable that comes with it. And I think part of that is on you. It's on you as the person listening, internalizing this history, understanding this history through other perspectives, whether you agree with it or not, really thinking about, you know, what is your place in this story? You know, every single person here has benefited from treaties in some way, or has lost because of treaties in some way. And we don't think about this as a full picture Minnesota history, Minnesota story. And it's important to think about it holistically in that way to understand those impacts. When we think about the history of Egan, of Black Dogs Village, you know, Peter talked about archaeologists and archaeology. And when I worked at the Historical Society, one of the benefits that I really loved about that work was that I got to actually work with some phenomenal archaeologists. Not all archaeologists are phenomenal, but a number of them, especially today, are. There are some good ones out there. And I had the great opportunity of working with an archaeologist in the last year before he retired, who showed me where Black Dogs Village was. And so the image of my sister and our children up here along the riverway, that was the first time I showed my sister where our village site was. She had never been there. You know, to be able to go down into that area, you know, part of the reason why that archaeologist showed me that space is because the park board at that point was going to direct a path directly through it. And he was worried. They were going to restructure the path directly through the village site, and they weren't going to communicate to any of the descendants of that village site. And there wasn't any reason to direct the path directly through it. They didn't need to. There was a question of whether they should put up signage to let the public know how important that site was. But as Native people, oftentimes, we don't necessarily want people to know where these sites are that are so important to us, because usually when people find out, they destroy them. And we saw that happen during the pandemic when an abundance of people were going out into state parks and going out and taking advantage of being outside, which was absolutely something that was incredibly important to do. But archaeologists found out that there were hobby archaeologists going out and digging up at historic proportions. The numbers went extremely high in terms of grave digging, looking to find items around mounds. And there are still a number of mounds here in the metro area. Some of them have been untouched. Some of them are probably in some of your backyards. And some of them have already been plowed through, like the ones by Black Dogs Village, in order to create the highway. And oftentimes people don't know that just because a mound has been plowed through doesn't mean it's gone. Oftentimes it just means it's 10 times as large because it's scattered, which is an extra large amount of area to protect and to understand how to connect with. A lot of times there's a separation that happens where people, will say that Dakota people, those aren't our relatives. They are our relatives. We know they're our relatives. We have oral histories. We have stories that have been passed down for generations. Are all of them our relatives? No. There's different tribes that came through at different times. And, there's unique histories to some of these different spaces. But it's not one people. It's not one story. And I think it's incredibly important to really sort of let go of that notion that we all know what happened and that we all have a sort of definitive response in terms of why it happened. As my children are being raised and I'm taking them to Berema Kaska and I'm taking them to these spaces that I didn't have the privilege of growing up in, it's important for them to know that they feel welcome. When it comes to land acknowledgements and things like that, I remember early on when people started doing those, and there was a guy who owned a condo in Egan, and he messaged me and said, "Hey, can you come do a land acknowledgement for my condo? We're going to have a party opening these units." And at the time, I was living in a tiny apartment with 2 kids, renting. And I said, "No, I'm not going to come and do your land acknowledgement." And I think when we think about, what is it that we need moving forward? How do we move forward together? It's really important to communicate directly with us as Native people and to ask us what is needed. I can't tell you how many times I get emails from people saying, "I want to donate my house. I want to donate some land." There's this interesting sort of connection to the land back movement, which is a movement that's been growing to return land to Native hands. But there's a lack of understanding where our tribes are today and the difference between tribe and community. And there's a lack of understanding that there are a number of Dakota people who still don't live within this state and have no representation. And it's important to do your homework and to understand that history and to understand those connections. And it's important that if you're interested in really giving back to community, to think about doing it with no strings attached. To do it in a way that's not putting more work on us. Hey, can you write a grant so that we can give you something? Things like that are again putting the burden back on us. And as beautiful as it is that I think we are even in a place where we can have these conversations today, there's still a way to go within these conversations. Because again, all of these things are helpful in things like land acknowledgements, things like public art that help to share our stories within public spaces, things like name reclamations of waterways and buildings and neighborhoods. But I think that, what these things do is they help and build that acknowledgement and that awareness. But we've been building acknowledgement and awareness for over 200 years. And it's time that we get to that next space, right? And so thinking about what is it that you can do? What can you take from what you've learned, and what kind of commitments can be made personally? Every single one of us can do something to help our neighbor or to help support the work of our communities. And there's a lot of amazing work happening in the community. I'm a vice chair of the board for Wakantipi Awayankapi, a wonderful, wonderful nonprofit here in St. Paul. Vision Maker Media, I'm on the board there, and that's a organization that works to tell our stories and share our stories out with the world. And so you can support us in the work that we're doing within our communities and within our community Native-led organizations. I think going right to the source and asking what you can do to help and in a way that doesn't add another burden on to a group of people is incredibly important. And learning how to listen. And so think about, my challenge here really, instead of really focusing so much on land acknowledgements, is really to focus on the best way to acknowledge this land and to acknowledge the people here is to make a commitment to do better. And I think all of us can do better. It's not a criticism, it's not a critique, it's just an open and honest call to be there for one another and to make sure that our children, our Dakota children, don't ever question whether this is their homeland. Pirame.
Okay, we're going to open it up for 10, 15 minutes of Q&A with all of you, the audience, and Alejandra will help with the mic.
Can you tell us a little more about the mounds? Was a mound built just for one person or a family or a grouping?
I think it depends on which community. Those different mounds have different historical periods. And there are different communities that have different traditions that are tied to some of those different periods of time. Oftentimes, when you think about where the mounds are, they're located along or near the riverways. And they're usually, when we buried our dead, we would, those scaffolds would be overlooking, like on a higher bluff. And then, when you think about those same spaces as being historically where those mounds are, I think you can make that connection of where some of these spaces historically are the same. And when you think about burial sites around the Twin Cities metro area, there are a lot of areas that are historic cemeteries that people don't understand. But Amakaska Lakewood Cemetery was a native cemetery before it was Lakewood Cemetery. I don't know that a lot of people understand that. What happened there? How old were those graves? I don't know. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just friends with some and used to work with some. But I do know that within our communities, we still have really, really strong connections to those sites. And I know that we have a lot of knowledge within our communities in terms of some of the people and the communities that are still, that were buried there. And a lot of that information is really deeply personal too.
And I can just add a few things kind of from the historical record. As Kate mentioned earlier when she was speaking that, of course, Dakota people are descendants of some of the people in these mounds, and others are ancestors of people that are members of different tribes today. So, for instance, in the 1700s, the 1800s, when the first Europeans came here and started making written records, they talked to Dakota elders and they said, who are in these burial mounds? And they said, oh, we believe some of those are from the Iowa people, but our people are in there too. So I think the complexities that Kate's alluding to, and in the public discourse sometimes when indigenous, rights to their homelands are questioned, sometimes it's things like that. People can look to sources and say, well, these are Iowa people in here, you don't have a right to this land. It's far more complex than that, and when full research is done, it almost always supports the oral histories and the things that indigenous people are trying to tell the rest of us about the land here. And one other thing to note that I think is important historically is that in these mounds, archaeologists in Minnesota have found artifacts like seashells that obviously don't come from Minnesota, and it's evidence of sophisticated trade networks and societies that existed here long before Europeans were ever here. So when we think about these native societies, hundreds, thousands of years ago, they were very sophisticated and linked to one another and constantly moving across the land. So
I think there's a lack of really understanding how much we traveled. We traveled far. And, there was a friend of mine who is an astronomer who was talking about how they're in Mexico and in Central America, there's mountains with Dakota names. And the fact that, oftentimes when you look at some of the mounds and you look at some of the historical record and the ways the anthropological terms, such as Hopewellian, are put in order to overgeneralize, who is in and sort of dehumanize who was buried. When we actually know that it was our ancestors, it wasn't only our ancestors, there were different tribes that added layers and added to that. But to create a different name for all of us that dehumanizes us and really has nothing to do with us is a strategy of separation.
As a part of some research I was doing, I was looking to see if the Dakota Expulsion Act had ever been repealed. And as far as my research came to, it was not repealed. And I'm wondering, is that correct, first of all? And has anyone ever done any efforts to try to repeal that?
Every year. To be honest, in 2012, there were some changes made where essentially the state of Minnesota made some changes so the Dakota Expulsion or the Dakota Removal Acts, there were actually 2 acts. They're still at the federal level. It's been changed at the state level. And so, there was an apology in 2012, and I was there. It was at a Pipestone at the Flandreau border, and the governor sent someone to give an apology. And basically, it's not something that's, enforced anymore. And it was something that, I don't know if it was amended, I can't remember, but they addressed it in 2012 at the state level, but it's still at the federal level. And I think that's what a lot of times people don't understand, is the different sort of levels of government we have to deal with within, any sort of topic at hand, especially as Native people with dual citizenship. And at the federal level, there have been a few attempts over more recent years to try to sort of deal with that. I think part of the issue is that we have 4 Dakota tribes within the state still, and a number of Dakota tribes outside the state. And people are very worried about what that would mean for the land holdings that they have left. And we want to respect tribal sovereignty. And so there's really a need for there to be, different tribes coming together to really think about how to repeal that in a way where I think we have to do it on our own outside of a legislative session, either within Minnesota or South Dakota, because the way politics work, people try and throw a bill in, and then somebody else says, well, you didn't talk to me about it. And then it doesn't make it as far as it needs to go, because there needs to be a lot more engagement that happens first. And there needs to be a lot of research and a lot of commitments to understand what the actual impact will be on the tribes that are still here.
Kind of 2-part, but one is that I've traveled a lot around the state looking at or staying at state parks, and I know that there were people before the European settlers there, but I just see a really missed opportunity kind of by government, by the History Center and DNR for not acknowledging, I know that's not there was a presence before the European settlers in that area. So I don't know if anything is happening on that area. And the other is about sacred sites and the giving back to the local tribes' sacred sites. I know there's some movement discussion, but I don't know where we're at with that.
I think there's been a lot of sort of returning of land, not a lot, not enough, but there's been some returning of land in Minnesota and in South Dakota and other spaces. Sometimes it's more successful when it's like a consortium of tribes, and land goes back to a consortium of tribes, and that way it's not going to a person or to one community, because just like every other community, we have intermarriage and we have people who have moved, and so it gets complicated. In terms of, who are the rightful sort of stewards. And I think there's this question of ownership versus stewardship that a lot of times people don't understand. We don't necessarily see ownership as under the same thing, but if you look at the Treaty of 1805, most Dakota people know verbatim, we reserve the right to pass, repass, and hunt these lands forever. That's not about ownership. It's about the fact that these are still our lands. What does that mean? We're the stewards of these lands, and we always will be, and we never gave that up. As far as state parks, I think there are some that are doing better than others. And there's been a lot of work that's happened over the last 5 years, in particular, 5-10 years, but especially the last 5 years. And a lot of that came out of serious issues and problems that came up. And what you're seeing is the response to a lot of frustrations that has accumulated over the years from tribes and community members who were tired of being left out of the narrative. And you still have a lot of updating to do, and you need resources to do that updating. And you need the people to write the panels, and you need the people to fundraise for the public art. It's all a process where we have to work together to do it. And I think that there are some examples that are better than others. There was just an article in the Star Tribune about Pipestone and the great work that they've been doing out there, and actually engaging with people, with Dakota people, and changing the way that things are changing the way that they work with and sort of interpret our cultural objects and life ways. And I think that there are still a lot of places that have a way to go. One of my favorite places to go is Catio State Park. As I'm a Bedewa Kantuan, our Dakota people, we have more than one creation story, and one of our creation stories is up there at Bedewa Kan, or Spirit Lake, also known as Mille Lacs. And so there's indentations there in the ground. And that's one of the things I've learned over the years, is to really look at those indentations in the ground. And at Catio State Park, there's this beautiful place within that park that shows where there was a Dakota village site. And some relatives of mine and some of the archaeologists there did some interpretation there. So there's some really good ones out there. And there's still a lot that have to be updated. And there's a lot of people who are trying to fundraise to try and sort of update them piece by piece.
Yeah, and I can speak some to like the interpretation at the Historical Society sites across the state and in some of the state parks. Kate and I worked together at the Historical Society for several years, as she mentioned, so she knows better than most about how political it is. And I think to link it back to this history, the Historical Society and the state of Minnesota, they are part of that history of settlement and erasure. If you look at our state flag, things like that, and the Historical Society, a group of employees, Kate was involved as well, did research on the history of our institution and its relationship with Native people, and it's very clear, and it wasn't a surprise to find, of course, the founders of that society were people like Henry Sibley, like Alexander Ramsey, who had a vested interest in perpetuating that erasure of Native people. So that made it into the interpretation at sites, even when a lot of the site network and state parks were developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of it was settler history or a social history, which was kind of dominant in the history field at that time. And we've been doing work to overturn that as much as we can, but if there's one impediment, it is its identity politics and the backlash that follows, and the state government, of course, being accountable to the people, and the DNR has a budget, and the Historical Society also receives millions from the state, so politics matter. And I'll just end with an anecdote. Kate, if you remember, I can remember when we were trying to change the interpretation at historic Fort Snelling and bring the story of Bedote forward. There was one point where our leadership was being called before the legislature to testify because the whole Bedote narrative was being questioned. And I'll never forget, myself and Kate and another employee, we were called together in a room and asked to put together a list of footnotes and sources that proved Bedote was even a thing, that it was a true story. And so that gives you an example. That was a few years ago. It's gotten a bit better, but
we knew where the sources were, so it wasn't a problem. But we as people who work in this field, doing this kind of historical analysis, oftentimes we have to work 3 times as hard to predict any sort of response that will come, because we get questioned right and left. And a lot of times it goes back to the historical record and the archive itself, and that's up for interpretation to whoever's opening that box. Just like it's open, the interpretation of whoever it was that was documenting. And if you think about, who is it, whose words are reflected in those boxes, it's primarily white men. And so, it's important to read between the lines. I think to go back to the question of the national parks or of the state parks, national parks, I think there's a lot of great work that's happening, but at the same time, there are limitations that I think are really frustrating in terms of they can only work with tribes within this country. And when you have Dakota people in Canada, when you have Ojibwe people in Canada, when you have our people across borders, they're not included. And so it's not complete engagement whatsoever. When we say we include, the Historical Society, I would have to used to send notices out to 23 tribes. Probably should have been 50.
So what about the redesign of the state flag? Is that going to proceed in a timely manner? And who is working on that that's reflecting the accurate history? And then back to the State Department of Education. What about the curriculum that our students are getting throughout their K-12 education? Is it a complicated process to get that curriculum change made and then being taught in a timely manner?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very complicated. I think that when it comes to the state flag, there's a committee that's getting put together, or a commission. I can't remember if there's calling it a commission or a committee that's getting put together right now. That's going to really help work towards what the next steps are going to be in that process. And I'm not entirely sure exactly where it's at, but I know there was a deadline a few weeks ago for something important, so there will probably be some new information soon. I serve in the Capital Area Architectural and Planning Board, so sometimes I get a little bit of a preview into some of that side of things from legislators, and so I do know that there is some work to come there. When it comes to curriculum, last week my dad and I presented at Shakopee at the casino there for the Understanding Native Minnesota. There was a convening for educators, and Rebecca Crook Stratton is doing some amazing work. She's the treasurer at Shakopee, and has been doing some amazing work in trying to make sure to create and support and advocate for Native curriculum throughout the state. I think one of the issues that we have is oftentimes it's voluntary. People can choose or not choose what they teach. And so making sure that it's required is incredibly important. But you also have to think about the quality of that education that's being taught. There was a great, I don't know if it was like a podcast, This American Life, NPR. There was John Biewen did this amazing piece in 2012 with Gwen Westerman, where they went to Mankato, Minnesota, and he interviewed teachers in Mankato and asked them how they taught about the Dakota War. And there was one teacher who said, well, I teach the kids that there were winners and losers, and Dakota people just didn't know how to use their words. And what that taught me is that just requiring it is not enough. We have to make sure that people understand how to teach it. Whether they're comfortable in teaching it is a whole other thing, because we do things we're uncomfortable with all the time. We got to get over this being afraid to be uncomfortable thing. We just have to do it. And we have to make sure to support Native people who are creating that curriculum. Darlene St. Clair is creating an amazing curriculum. There's a group called Dakota Wichoha, out of Lower Sioux, that she's been working with to create wonderful curriculum. There's some great people creating curriculum, but I think it's really important for us to understand that Native education, that information, as well as educating our students about ourselves and about supporting Native students, that was all promised in treaties. And there's a reason why the Indian Ed departments exist. There's a reason why we say that these things, it shouldn't be questioned whether they're there or not. But unfortunately, it's highly political. The same people who were attacking me when I was working at the Historical Society, that were part of a conservative think tank, is the same group that then was planting people in school board meetings and campaigns across the state. And so, you know, there's a very organized conservative effort to keep Native history out of our schools. And they have a lot of money.
Okay, I have two quick things. Number one, the women. You said that for 200 years the women were influential and were marrying. I just want to point out that that was not always by choice. And then you said that your great-grandfather was white and married an Indian woman. Can you talk about, this was not rare. This was something that a lot of white men were doing in order to steal land. They were having children with Native women, and then as soon as they had children and had a claim to the land, they were bringing white wives. If you could talk about that. And then also the Pond brothers. Just because we're in Bloomington, they are spoken of like they're heroes, and they were actually incredibly racist. If you would like to talk about that.
No, absolutely. I spent 5 years looking through the Pond Brothers papers, and I feel like it's a personal relationship with them in some ways, because I've read their family letters. I've understand that Gideon was a hell of a lot worse than his brother, Samuel. I think just from his letters and the way he talked about our traditions and who we are as Native people, he didn't mince words. Gideon did not mince words, and it's really problematic. And I think, you know, when it comes down to, you know, my ancestry in terms of my grandfather, you know, I hate how they say he took a Dakota wife or he had a Dakota wife. They were married. Whether there was a romantic relationship there, we don't know. It's possible. Is it likely, given the fact that there were multiple daughters of Cloudman, at least 2 daughters of Cloudman that married white military officers or government agents, and most of that was for relationship building, right? And you're right, it was a way to get in with community, and to think about, you know, what that meant from the Dakota point of view. I don't really fully understand it because I'm not in their heads and I don't know what happened. But I do feel like what I learned in terms of what happened afterwards, the fact that he deserted her and then left and came back with a white wife, and some of the stories that have been passed down, I know it wasn't, you know, the best relationship, so I'm guessing that, you know, it was one of those things that was done out of trying to get access to land and power, and that was done through exploiting women, which is highly problematic. And to be a product of that hurts. To know and to wonder, you know, what happened. But that's part of history too, is people experience really difficult things and we don't always have all the answers. And I think part of the problem that I've seen in academia is there's been a lot of white scholars in the past who have said, this is my idea of what happened. And they will even talk about the Dakota War. They'll put words in the mouths of the warriors at Acton, Minnesota. You know, they'll create a narrative that's an assumption and a guess. And yes, a lot of the historical record is up for interpretation. But then don't say that you have the direct answer for it. You know, it's okay to say we don't know.
Yeah, and I want to very much thank you for bringing up those nuances and the complexities of history. So, it's very much true that these marriages during the fur trade, Indigenous women's experience could range all the way from what we would consider enslavement to, possibly true love. And just like any relationships that you would see today, they were all different, and the politics of it all varied from situation to situation. And you're also very much right that the family I highlighted here, the McLeods, were somewhat the exception to the rule, that they were married, they stayed married, they had a home here, and Mary, she lived in Bloomington past Martin McLeod's death in 1860, that they stayed together. For most instances, it is what Dr. Beane and you're talking about, that it was used to the advantage of white traders when the time came for statehood and treaties to be made. And people like the infamous Henry Sibley, he had a Dakota wife, he had a Dakota child, and when he saw the writing on the wall, he conveniently left his Dakota wife and remarried a white woman, and his Dakota daughter, he barely acknowledged her, but he used the relationships he built through his marriage to a Dakota wife. He used that in the treaty making. He used those relationships to his advantage into the state making process. So I think that is very much important to point out, that it was also a tool of colonization and taking land.
I'll mention too with Seth Eastman, that white wife that he brought back was Mary Eastman, who documented Dakota life quite a bit. And her documentation of Dakota women was not always very respectful. And so that kind of says something to me as well. He did care for his Dakota child. Didn't respond to the grandkids, but he did leave within the warehouse. You know, they knew that if she needed something, she could have it. She would be supported. But I think one thing I want to mention about the Pond brothers is, you know, when I first started taking Dakota language classes at the University of Minnesota, we would use the dictionaries that were, you know, that were largely created because of the Riggs and because of Riggs and the Pond brothers and the work that they did as early missionaries documenting our language at Bademakaska. And when I first started looking through their papers, I felt really angry with them, because I was so mad that here are two guys who had the opportunity to be completely immersed in my language with my family, and I really struggled to learn my language. It was hard, and it was emotional, it was difficult, and not always so intuitive, and I struggled with it. And I was really angry about the fact that these two white guys could just learn my language and be immersed with my family. And then I started looking through their papers, and I found out they really struggled, and they never became fluent. And I didn't know that. I didn't understand that. But looking through their paperwork to see their attempts at writing their family in our language and butchering our language made me feel a little bit better that maybe I wasn't so terrible. And you know, that's a human response, I think. They were trying to learn the language, but the reason that they were trying to learn our language, and they say it, is that they were documenting a dying race of people, is what they said. And they were documenting our language according to their Christian beliefs. And so the translations in the dictionaries are not the same translations that we as Dakota people would have.
And I was curious, whenever I've heard talks like this, the focus has always been on the relatively recent indigenous people within Minnesota, Dakota, Ojibwe. But in terms of a percentage of the indigenous living in this area, it's like 10% of how long indigenous people have lived in Minnesota. Is there, and you mentioned it briefly, you talked about the mound builders, you mentioned the Iowa people, but it was like 30 seconds. Is that there's very little information, or is it just that you're focusing on what is the easiest to find, the most there's known about? I'm just curious, as there's a lot of information about the people before Ojibways, before the Dakota people came.
Well, I think it depends on the area that you're talking about. If you're talking about this area, and if you go down to Badote, there's documentation of 10,000 years of habitation there at Badote, what people today know of as Fort Snelling. But that's the site of our creation as Dakota people. And so our existence goes back thousands of years. So, you know, there is no disconnect for us from that, and the fact that we are the indigenous people of this land. This is Dakota territory, and when we talk with other Dakota people or other Native people, you know, when we used to send documentation out to other tribes and other groups of people, including the Iowa, including Ojibwe, it had anything to do around Fort Snelling, around Badote, they would say, that's Dakota territory. You go to Dakota people. If you're talking about more southern Minnesota, there would be areas that are closely tied to the Iowa, and Ojibwe history goes much further out towards the east, and they actually migrated here.
Yeah, and again, you know, thank you for pointing out more complexities of history. So, you know, the Iowa, the Oto, the Cheyenne, the Sauk and the Fox, the Ho-Chunk, the Ojibwe, they all have connections to this area as well. Some of them have called this, their home. They have lived here. They've passed through. They consider parts of it sacred as well. And so I think that's important to point out, and I thank you for that. And as Kate mentioned, we've done that work, and Kate's worked with those tribes too, especially when we were both working on the work at historic Fort Snelling a couple of years ago. And I think you also used a really important word, revisionist history. And as a historian, and Kate, you can speak to this too. We always say that all history is revisionist history. More research is done. Every historian strives towards accuracy, but you also bring your own inherent, yourself to that work. So as a historian, you're interpreting history, and everybody will interpret it differently, as Kate's mentioned. But as time has gone on and our society has become more inclusive, things like this can happen. The revision that we may talk about, it's just about being more inclusive, and my experience as a historian, it's only ever made the history more accurate, actually.
And it's an additive process. It's not taking away. It's not, saying that somebody else didn't have an experience somewhere. And it's not saying that we can't talk about that. But I think, to be inclusive, we have to really think about who are the people we're talking about. One of my favorite people to work with at the historical study was Peter's wife, Maddie Harper DeCarlo, Dr. DeCarlo. She's Ojibwe, and we're really good friends. And we both came at the work with our own biases. Me as Dakota, her as Ojibwe. We were like button heads left and right, but we had respect for one another. And we understood and saw the expertise of the other, and really valued each other's perspectives, and were able to have those conversations. And I don't understand why we as a society can't be more like that. I think it's really important to realize that within all these different stories and narratives, you're going to have a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives, and that's a good thing. It doesn't have to be a terrible thing. It's a matter of being respectful of one another, and of really looking at, some of that evidence. When we talk about revision, we were criticized a lot for oral history, saying, oh, well, that's just oral history. And a lot of the people who criticized the work that we were doing for being oral history would then cite the Pond brothers. And if you go into the Pond brothers' papers and you look at where that information came from that they were using, it was because the Pond brothers went and asked a Dakota person. They did oral history.
Okay, well, with that, I think we'll close it out tonight, and we want to thank all of you for coming here and for a wonderful discussion. So thank you, and careful going home in the heat, everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, Maya.